Today's topic is the future of sustainable building in Manitoba and beyond. Our presenter is Lindsay Oster. She is the principal architect with Prairie Architects. About today's session is the current climate crisis is undeniable, and with the Canadian government making steps to formalize its climate change obligations, there is certainly no shortage of sustainable certification programs, targets, and criteria that suppliers are being faced with every day. This presentation will take a broader focus on what the future for sustainable projects look like in Manitoba and other similar jurisdictions, and help suppliers to understand the direction that design professionals are headed. Okay, so before we get started, I just want to quickly thank our lunch sponsor, that is the Sexton Group. Sexton Group is an independently owned buying group for building materials, lumber, hardware, and manufactured structures. They are a dedicated team of industry experts focused on their independent members' success. They negotiate strong, regionally competitive programs for all their members coast to coast. They are committed to their 300 members, representing over 400 locations in every province and territory in Canada. Sexton Groups works for their members every day, so their members can focus on what's most important to them, their business. Okay, just a few little housekeeping items. We are currently live. We are currently being taped. So if you need to access Lindsay's education session, you can either check out our website or check out it in the app. And if you're wondering, where is that? We have an FAQ icon on the app, and the link is right there. Now, to make the most out of this education session, let's discuss how you can ask some questions. So depending on which platform you're using, you can type in your question in the Q&A, the chat, or the ask option. So if you're using the Zoom platform, it's the Q&A and the chat is on the bottom. Or if you're using the app on the desktop, it's also super easy. There's an ask tab, type in your question, hit enter, and we will facilitate those at the end. So just a little bit about Lindsay. Well, Lindsay is an architect and principal of Prairie Architects Incorporated, a Winnipeg-based firm specializing in sustainable architecture for many institutional, residential, adaptive reuse, and community-based projects. Prairie Architects Incorporated has received numerous awards for sustainable, heritage preservation, and accessibility excellence, with many more praises for their firm's LEED Platinum CI certified office, as well as the LEED Platinum certified building blocks on Balmoral, a childcare facility for Canada's Life and the first standalone daycare to receive this prestigious designation. All right, Lindsay, you want to take it over and go over the future of sustainable buildings?
Sure, great. Thank you, Erin. That's quite a mouthful, so thank you. I'm going to share my screen here. Make sure this is all working. Okay, everybody can see that? Okay, thank you so much for having me, for inviting me to be here. I was saying that I often give presentations to architects and clients, but this is the first time that I've had an audience like all of you here today. So I'll be really interested in some of your feedback and questions that you may have. So I will get right into it. There was a bit of an introduction already into some of the types of work that we do. So again, Prairie Architects Inc., my firm, is a Winnipeg-based firm. We're registered to practice in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Ontario. And as was mentioned, we specialize in sustainable architecture. So for us, understanding the enormous impact that buildings have on the environment and climate change in particular has led us to specialize in this sustainable framework for design and construction. And it's led us to have 29 LEED certified buildings and many more in the queue. So the industry uses lots of different words for sustainability. The list goes on and on and on. And there are probably 3 times as many different certification programs and designations and different standards that go along with all of these terms. So as was mentioned, my presentation is going to dig a little bit deeper into actually what we mean by all of this. And most importantly for you, what it means for the future of the supply chain and design and construction. So it's a little bit of that crystal ball. So let's start by talking about what sustainability actually refers to. So first of all, it's a noun and defined as the ability for something to be maintained at a certain rate or level. So given the current context of climate change and the crisis that we find ourselves in, I think that what we need to really look at is that we probably don't want to be maintaining the current rate or level. This is a graph that specifically shows Winnipeg. However, it's a similar story for other jurisdictions. So it's a graph from the Climate Atlas of Canada, and it basically shows yearly values for 24 different climate models from 1950, so using historic data, all the way to predictions to 2095. So the different lines, the dashed lines sort of at the top and bottom are the 10th and 90th percentile values. But taking a look at this black line, solid line in the middle is the mean of all of the assembled climate models. And so you can see that in 2021, it is estimated that there will be 21.3 days that fall into the very hot category. So this means over 30 degrees Celsius. If you compare that to 2095, the prediction is that there will be 74.3 days over 30 degrees. And then to underscore the severity of this, it's estimated that of those 21.3 days, of those very hot days, actually 4.2 of them will be over 34 degrees Celsius. And when you look at 2095, over half of those days will be over that 34 degrees Celsius. So this data shown here represents a scenario which assumes that greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase at current rates. So that's the foreseeable future in Winnipeg if we do nothing except keep doing as we're doing. So in other words, this is the sustainable outlook. And so you can see that it's certainly not going to cut it. So what should we be talking about then? Should we be talking about mitigation or reducing the severity or seriousness or painfulness of something? Should we be talking about adaptation, changing to become better suited to our environment? And resilience, being able to recover quickly from difficulties. And so I know it doesn't really roll off of the tongue, but maybe we need to add yet another term to the mix. I think we should be talking about something like mitigadapsilience, because it needs to be a verb. We need action, right? So my made up word is a verb. And it's precisely where I think the design and construction industry can play a huge role. So what does this mean for architects and perhaps more importantly for all of you? How will this impact the types of products and systems that we specified? So to paint a little bit of a clear picture of the role that buildings and construction play in all of this, you can take a peek at these two pie charts from the 2020 Global Status Report, which show that in 2019, building construction and operations accounted for the largest share of both the global final energy use, so 35% for energy use, and energy-related CO2 emissions of 38%, as shown in orange on both of these. So according to this, taking climate action in buildings and construction is among the most cost-effective way to meet our climate change commitments. So further to this, the global building stock is set to double by 2050. So this is a frightening statistic if greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase at those current rates we talked about. However, it's also an enormous opportunity if the construction industry as a whole embraces these strategies to mitigate the effects of climate change, to adapt the way that we're currently doing things, and to ultimately achieve zero emission, efficient and resilient building stock. So this is a really great website, climateactiontracker.org. And it's a collaboration between two different organizations, the Climate Analytics Group and New Climate Institute. This website basically tracks government climate action and the measures, and it measures it, against the Paris Agreement and the aim of holding global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius and instead pursuing efforts to even limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so they look at different countries and basically give them a scorecard, which I'll show you Canada's in a minute here. But also, in terms of Canadian statistics, it is estimated that 75% of the buildings in Canada that will exist in 2030 have already been built. So this makes accelerating energy efficient renovations and retrofits crucial if we're going to be decarbonizing the building sector. And it will also play a massive role and a key factor in job recovery or economic recovery through job creation. So the climate action tracker that I was talking about, it hasn't actually undertaken analysis of the building stock in Canada. However, they estimate that for the US and the EU, they would need to renovate 3.5% of their existing building stock each year in order to be compatible with that 1.5 degree temperature limit in the Paris Agreement. So it's a massive, massive undertaking. And unfortunately, Canada has missed all of its previous emission targets that it set over the last 3 decades. So we missed the 2012 target under the Kyoto Accord by more than 100 million tons. And it is expected that the 2020 target was actually missed by an even wider margin. So while climate experts say Canada is now on track to miss the 2030 Paris target, which was the aim was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30% lower than the 2005 emissions. There is action, and you can see in this slide here, recent announcements to formalize plans. And without getting into the politics of it, obviously there's some massive hurdles. So this is Canada's scorecard on that climate action tracker website that I was talking about. And you can see that as Canada continues to implement its climate strategy, it still remains far from meeting the target. So it's actually our grade is insufficient. We're at 3 degrees Celsius, which is not going to cut it. And actually, prior to the pandemic, the government was set to miss its targets by quite a wide margin. And so while emissions in 2020 were projected to fall by, I think, between 11 and 13%, comparatively to 2019, basically as a result of the pandemic, Canada's still likely to miss its targets for 2020 targets by a margin of 15 to 20%, according to the climate action tracker. So even the combined effect of all of the additional planned policies and COVID-19 and the economic impact, it's still not enough to meet Canada's targets, unless things change. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know, what is changing. So we know codes are changing. New model national energy codes for new buildings are in the final stages of development for the 2020 cycle. And these codes will apply to small buildings and homes, as well as commercial and institutional buildings. And critical is that they go beyond just a single improvement target, and instead they start to set out tiers or stepped performance targets that will lead to net zero energy ready performance so that jurisdictions can adopt them by 2030. Past iterations of the model code have only had incremental raises to the default minimums that buildings were standards they were built to. However, in 2016, the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change committed to net zero energy ready building, a model building code by 2030. So that in doing so, they've defined a new future for Canada's built environment that will enable the building sector to embrace high energy efficient building practices. And once we start doing that, it will help to promote further innovation. What else do we know? We know that additional investments are being made. So in Canada, the 2019 budget included additional investments of nearly $1 billion in the Green Municipal Fund. And so this provides funding for Canadian municipalities to increase energy efficiency in homes and buildings. And so this new investment was meant to support 3 main initiatives to launch in 2020. So this was the community efficiency financing to support municipalities in offering the various innovative financing programs for homeowners. The second one is a sustainable fund affordable housing developments that would target both retrofits and new builds that would be able to work toward net zero energy standards. And the last one is collaboration on community climate action, which was to create a network of 7 low carbon climate centers that would be spread across major cities in Canada and establish new and different funding streams to be able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from large community buildings and other infrastructure. We also know that massive economic stimulus is going to be required in the wake of COVID-19. So the 2020 Global Status Report touches a little bit on what that outlook for 2021 is, and says unequivocally that the time for action to decarbonize the existing and future global building stock is now. So stimulus packages offer incredible opportunity to promote net zero building practices, and this will include deep building renovations and as well as performance standards for newly constructed buildings. So this graph here shows a number of jobs created per $1 million of capital investment and spending by measure. So you can see in orange here, the mid part of the graph, that the highest values are in the building efficiency categories. So building efficiency retrofits as well as efficient new buildings, clearly the forerunner there. And there appears to be an increasing will to act. So there's certainly mounting global pressure being placed on governments. And we're also starting to see signs that a climate-focused agenda seems to dovetail into the priorities of a new US administration. So Wednesday, 2 days ago, Wednesday's executive order on tackling climate change crisis at home and abroad. So I think that we can assume that through some collaboration with industry organizations and businesses and government, that significant progress will be made to ensure that buildings are starting to be recognized as that critical component in achieving the Paris Agreement goals. And we know that there are multiple initiatives already underway that will enable that, basically that market transformation that's so necessary towards complete decarbonization. And so all we have to do is really look to other jurisdictions that have already been successful in doing some of this. So tiered building codes are not new to Canada. BC introduced its step code in 2017, and some of you may even be familiar working with it. It's a tiered code is basically, quite simply, an incremental approach to achieving more energy efficient buildings. So it's a series of steps that start with the base building code sort of minimum under step 1 there. And then each successive step goes further and further toward achieving a net zero energy building or a net zero energy ready building with more and more percentage efficiency. So generally the lower tiers are relatively straightforward to meet. And then the upper steps have a bit more ambitious and targets and offer more of an opportunity to adopt an integrated approach to building design, which involves talking to suppliers and supply chain, and that integrated approach to building design that incorporates the design layout and framing techniques and system selection and material selection. So it's being done, and it's being done really well. And actually, other jurisdictions are reaching out to BC and having, people from the City of Vancouver visit City of Winnipeg officials, for instance, so that jurisdictions really can start to implement these types of codes themselves. So what does this all mean then for someone, like an architect specifying products? What are we going to be looking toward doing? So number one, all of this means that there's a need for an extreme focus on the building envelope. So all of the systems in a passive way that can help with that adaptation and mitigation and resilience for buildings. So minimizing, this is actually from the BC step code, but looking at minimizing thermal bridges. So the super highways of taking all of the energy out of our buildings and in a wasteful way. So any breaks in insulation that basically act like a bridge to carry out all the heat. So for architects and engineers, taking a closer look at the corners and junctions and gaps within our projects and specifying materials that actually help to minimize those thermal bridges where supports, for instance, are needed. So there's room for material and supply innovation. So, thermally broken fiberglass clips for cladding. There's some really amazing balcony thermal bridge detailing products available now too. So you can see the innovation in the market as a result of a need to address a design problem with the climate. So also air tightness, this orange one here, seal it up, they say. So air tightness is critical because with air leaks come heat leaks. And so increasingly codes are going to start having mandatory air tightness and air change thresholds. And so I think we'll start seeing a lot more air tightness testing as a requirement at different stages in construction to make sure that we're proving and we've got the metrics to say that the buildings are airtight. Quite critically, thinking about any of the openings in our building envelope. So thinking about doors and windows and the efficiency, their energy performance, and where we locate them, size, all of that sort of thing. Of course, insulation and, coming from Winnipeg deep freeze that we've had this past week, certainly in order to reduce the heat loss that we have, increasing insulation in walls, floors, roof, and foundation is important. And I'll talk a little bit later in the presentation about what kinds of insulation we need to be starting to take a closer look at. And then less to do with the building envelope, but also, equally important, ventilating smartly. So bringing fresh air, we heat recovery units and exhaust leaving the building, and also specifying efficient appliances and machines to ensure that we've got enough heat and cool for our buildings, but not more than we need. So number 2, we will be moving toward a net zero energy or net zero energy ready building stock in order to plan for the future. There's no question about it as we start looking at the types of codes that are coming their way for Canada. So according to the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, construction costs for net zero energy buildings have dropped by about 40% in the past decade, and they're continuing to fall. So it's clear that the benefits of net zero building are significant, with estimated operating costs basically in the range they say here of 30 to 55% less than for a typical house, depending on your region or fuel type and occupant behavior. So it's significant, and clients will start demanding it, and so they should when you see those kinds of operational savings. I've included a picture of one of the projects that we recently completed, that building blocks on Balmoral that was mentioned earlier. Not because it's net zero energy or even net zero energy ready, but because it has started to give those future considerations to what net zero ready might be. So the client looked at solar panels, and at the time it just was not feasible, but we planned for them. So basically all of the south facing portions of the roofs have been structured to allow for future addition of solar panels, and the system has basically been designed to plug and play once they come on board. So incremental steps are still better than no steps. And then also focus on existing building stock. So you keep hearing me say, existing building retrofits and renovations. So remembering again that since more than 75% of the building stock in 2030 is already composed of buildings that are built today, we know that there's going to be an increasing focus on those adaptive reuse projects and retrofits. And then they'll no doubt be supported by the very innovative policies like having building labeling for your energy performance or establishing these kinds of actual retrofit codes, and then coming along with low-cost financing for retrofits. So we can't just think about new construction projects. Accelerating energy efficiency and energy efficient renovations and retrofits is crucial if we're going to talk about decarbonizing the building sector. And again, as I mentioned, this plays a key role in economic recovery through job creation. So interestingly, I also learned in doing some research for this presentation, actually, that there are plans to develop a model code for existing buildings by 2022. So it'll help guide energy efficiency improvements when we're renovating buildings. So we'll look for that. And then the value chain, right? So I've talked a lot about what government and what regulation can do. But the 2020 Global Status Report also talks about it being a time for radical collaboration between public and private actors across the entire value chain and across mitigation, adaptation, and health agendas. So the so-called actors along the value chain, I think it means adopting concepts around a circular economy, to reduce the demand for construction materials and lower embodied carbon, and adopting those nature-based solutions that start to enhance building resilience. And so just, you know, there are lots of examples of manufacturing-based circular economies. This one here, you know, so first of all, I guess I should say circular manufacturing, for those that don't know, seeks to reduce the use of materials and energy in the manufacturing of products and services, and then recover as much of the end use product as possible through reuse and recycling. And like I said, it's not a new thing. Here's an example of Heineken's efforts, as they say, to brew a better future. Also, I think that what's becoming increasingly important in the discussion on carbon is that we need to, and especially with respect to the value chain and supply chain, we need to be talking both about operational carbon, so the carbon that takes when we are operating our buildings, and perhaps even more critically, the embodied carbon. So a lot more study is going into defining what actually embodied carbon is. So this refers to the greenhouse gas emissions that are produced in the full structure life cycle. So it's the manufacturing, it's the maintenance, it's the decommissioning, like right from the extraction of raw materials, transporting to site, what it takes, the carbon it takes to construct the buildings, to use and maintain, and then thinking of the end of life cycle when we demolish buildings because we don't build them durable enough, or we have short lifespans on them, and hauling away the waste and then taking them to the landfill or recycle. Like these products, these buildings that we have an embodied carbon footprint that's really important to remember. And because emission reduction strategies typically focus on the operational aspect of it, it's interesting now that there are efforts to address the greenhouse gas emissions from more of an embodied perspective. And actually, as of May 2017, I think, developers in Vancouver that are seeking rezoning application, they also now need to comply with very stringent sustainability requirements, including reporting on whole body embodied carbon or whole building embodied carbon. So carbon counters and become really important. And so I think you need, as a crystal ball, I think that's coming. And this just, you know, sort of further emphasizes the point of how important embodied carbon is. So this is from Architecture 2030, but basically from the Global Status Report that says embodied carbon will be responsible for almost half of total new construction emissions between now and 2050. So we definitely need to start shifting our focus toward that. So for us as architects, we have to start looking at products differently. So the image on the left shows the carbon impacts of various different types of insulations. And it really starts to show the difference between the net emitters and the net sequesterers, if that's even a word. So the plants and animals that take carbon out of the atmosphere because they use the carbon to help build their structures, that's what we're going to start seeing in the marketplace. And that's what we're going to start placing value on. So when you see wool, dense packed cellulose, cork, hempcrete, and straw bale, if you're looking at this dotted line here, all of the orangey yellow ones here are net emitters of carbon, and all of the green colored ones here on the other side of the line, and they sequester carbon. So huge benefit there. And then the image on the right shows an example of a template of an environmental product declaration, so an EPD form, which will start, architects will start using these a little bit more to allow us to be able to distill various product information into the categories that make sense for us to be evaluating, and help us to compare apples to apples between products. And make informed decisions when we're going to be specifying building materials. So you can imagine submitting to various offices information that's going to have to fit on these types of forms. And finally, for many of us architects and designers, we're going to just have to keep doing what we're doing with the rest of it. So it's the mentality, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. So a lot of the things we've been doing, whether it's LEED or some other certification program, there's still fundamental value in that. And there's need to focus on aspects of human health and happiness. So access to daylight, in the office I'm in right now, focusing on things like water use reduction, local materials, renewable materials, recyclable, and healthy indoor air quality, all of those types of things. That's not going away. But when we're talking about a crystal ball, some of the things that I touched on in this presentation, I think are starting to give a little bit of an insight into what that crystal ball is for us anyway. So with that, that was probably a lot. I think we're probably okay for time to take some questions.
Yeah, we do. And we do have some questions. So I'm going to start with one that came in through the Q&A. So this is from Dwight, and Dwight owns a retail store or lumberyard. He says, from a retail standpoint, where would you start in educating customers and contractors?
So this is a great first question, actually, because I think it touches on a lot of what I talked about. But so for instance, FSC wood is a perfect example of that. And given the choice of different types of wood, and a customer comes into your store and might not really know the difference or not understand what they're buying, or what they're if there's a premium associated with something, what the actual value is with that. So I think retailers can play a huge part in that education piece, because you're the face, you're that interface between the customer, end use product customer, and us in a lot of ways. And it's interesting because the market shifts, and we've seen that. I mean, I haven't been in the industry for 50 years, but I've been around long enough to see some of that shift. So when we started specifying no urea formaldehyde millwork, so it was basically poison injected into the wood and millwork of projects that we're working on. When we started specifying that 20 years ago, the cost premiums to do it were just astronomical. And so it was such an uphill battle. Talking to clients about long-term costs versus upfront capital, all that. Now, you would be hard pressed to find millwork that has urea formaldehyde in it. So it's about market transformation because of availability, because of supply, because of knowledge of people demanding that they live and work and play in buildings that don't make them sick. So I think as retailers, that, you know, education piece, little name or signage plaques or something like that could actually go quite a long way.
Thank you. That was great. And thank you, Dwight, for that question. We have one from Ron Funk. How do you view the use of ICFs, particularly above grade use, to help achieve more efficient buildings?
Interesting. So we have used ICF on a few projects anyway, and I mean, the inherent value of insulation and the benefits it provides certainly, you know, cannot be underscored enough. But I am becoming increasingly aware of looking at things rather than sort of on a product by product basis in a more holistic building sense. So sometimes putting the best of everything together is just not feasible. And so for us, energy modeling has become a way that we can start quantifying some of the decision and the trade-offs that we make. And I know this doesn't specifically answer the question of ICFs. To answer that, yes, incredible value, and I think it makes a ton of sense. But it's not always the right answer for every single project. It becomes really important when, you know, the staging of a project and when shoring becomes for foundations becomes really important, and not wanting excessive costs and construction sequencing. You know, there's other sort of benefits to it more than just the incredible value it brings from an insulation factor. So yes, but in context of the full building package, I think.
Okay, thank you for that question, Ron. So a question came in through the app again, which is, how do you source materials? How do you find new materials, or how do you research and come up with new materials or hear about new materials?
Great question as well. So we have a staff of 18 people, predominantly architects and interns and graduate students, but we have a key role in our office. Her name is Alara. She is our sustainable buildings coordinator. And she's not an architect, and it's a good thing she's not, because she doesn't get pulled in any other sort of direction. She takes her entire focus and dedication on projects is to the sustainable aspect side of things. So for in terms of the research, a lot of that comes through her and that role that we have in the office, but it's also, it can't just be one person. So our staff, we are predominantly, you know, we have our certain designations. We're lead accredited professionals, majority of us anyway. I recently, actually just this week, found out that I passed my exam for Passive House certification. So now I'm, I think, the only architect in Manitoba that has that designation. And I think that's going to start changing as well. Because the more we become a part of a community of people that are like-minded, that's where we start to hear about some other products. That's where we start to see buildings that have been done, systems that have been used and used well. And the more that starts happening and we start pushing it and specifying it, then the more those things start to come to market. So a lot of the products that, you know, you need for passive house standards used to only be in Europe and elsewhere. And as the market starts shifting, you know, with all the projects in Vancouver and Toronto and elsewhere, you're starting to see those things coming to Canadian market because we're demanding it. And certainly Winnipeg and our harsh climate, we need the best of the best. So innovation and research is always a big part of it for us.
Are roles like sustainability coordinators common or becoming more common in architectural firms?
You know, we've always had one. We've always valued it. I don't know that it's actually common. I present often to University of Manitoba. Students do sessional sort of instruction, and there are often a lot of questions for people that, like, that's the route that I want to take, and how do you get into that? And I think we've carved out a little bit of a specialized niche for our office, but I do see it shifting. Like all the things that I talked about today, it is increasingly important that all projects, not just the quote unquote sustainable ones, but all projects are going to have to take this quite seriously and need the expertise to be able to do that. And so for us anyway, having a dedicated person in the office to do that holds us accountable to do it and not sort of get pulled. If it was up to me only, I get pulled in millions of different directions and it becomes hard. So
yeah, we just wanted a quick, lovely comment from Paul, who just wanted to say, hi, Lindsay. It's great to see what information architects are looking at moving forward, and thank you.
you're welcome.
We do have another question again. So they wanted to know who's making the most headway when it comes to, say, making these changes. When it comes to, is it commercial? Is it residential? Who's driving the changes? Who is like making the request?
Interesting. Very good question as well. I would say it started with government. So in Manitoba anyway, I don't know how many years ago, but all projects that were had government funding were required to have a certain level of sustainability and LEED certification. So it used to be that when you built a school, it had to achieve LEED Gold, and it was just part of what you had to do. So firms, you know, even trying to get the work had to have that level of ability and expertise to do it. I would say now, so jurisdictionally, government demands it, and so it's less so in private. And so we found anyway, it's more in the public sphere. However, I think now it is being driven more by just a need, like the climate crisis. We have no choice but to react. And so really, you know, Vancouver, I can't stress enough how what they're doing is really being looked at internationally even as a model for how this can be done successfully. And I know that I've seen a lot of presentations from various personnel with the city of Vancouver, with the province, or different, you know, organizations of just reaching out to different jurisdictions and saying, this is how we did it, and this is how you can also do it. So yeah, from different directions, I think.
Okay. This one is actually just one that came up on the chat. I'm hoping I'm saying it right for the person. They were talking, but you mentioned a lot of incentives to push people towards this. Do you see things going into a trend of strong penalties or punishments to not do it?
Yeah, I mean, if it's code, then the punishment is you don't get a building permit. You don't get to occupy your building. If you don't meet these stringent requirements, you're out of luck. So this is where things like air tightness testing that I mentioned come into play, and others. By having those quantifiable metrics. So not just saying, we're specifying, we're designing it, we're doing the best we can, so you know that means it's going to be a great building. By actually having the energy modeling, having the reporting that's necessary after, by having air tightness testing in various pieces, you have to prove that what you've planned to do, that you've actually successfully done it, and that the whole team has come together. So not just specifying, but having the personnel on site, the constructors, be able to actually execute the details. So it's a real integrated approach that, yeah, it has a carrot, but it also has a stick now.
Oh, that's a good way to put it, actually. This question's from Rory. He was wondering, is there one program or target that's becoming more widely adopted? Is it net zero, passive house, or is it just going to be a combination of those?
Yeah, so again, Vancouver's a really great example here. LEED is the sort of the best certification, highest level of certification in many ways, and the generally accepted. And in Vancouver, you know, even years ago, LEED is just a byproduct of what they do. They end up achieving LEED certification because they're doing all of these other things, whether it's through their step code or other practices. But now passive house is that next level, that next standard, and it's becoming the next standard because it takes just the low-hanging fruit, like I said, of looking at building envelope and looking at systems. Before we talk about net zero, I mean, we could say any building is net zero if we just cram it full of solar panels and wind turbines and all of these things. But that's where you get to, like, well, the cost is astronomical. We're not able to do this. So passive house is a strict, stringent sort of set of standards that first you bring down your building to the most efficient in a passive way. So your orientation, your building envelope, all of those things, so that in the end, all you need is a very small bit to make it net zero. So I think that's where the trend is going, and it's certainly where we see our future work headed.
Okay, and that's interesting, and that's something that you just became certified on.
Yeah, just this week.
Okay, and is that something a lot of architects are now getting certified on, that we could expect to sort of see these requests or these sort of changes coming into buildings?
I hope so. Like I said, I, as far as I know, I am the first architect in Manitoba to do this. There are a lot more. Vancouver has been doing passive house and doing it very well for a long time. It's an international. It's actually a German program, and so internationally, it's quite recognized and renowned as a high standard for building. And I think the prairies are late adopters.
Yeah.
We're sort of we don't get the high highs, but we don't get the low lows as a result either. So the benefit is we get to learn and choose carefully how we plan to execute on some of these things. And so for us, passive house, it's the next sort of step of what we see energy efficiency being.
Okay. One more question. And just a reminder, if anybody has questions, just type them below. We've got some great questions here. As an architect, what do you think the biggest myth that you have to bust when it comes to things like net zero or passive house? Is there a lot of myths that this is expensive or it's too difficult?
Yes. So one of the all the time is cost. I mean, that's what conversations with clients and contractors and trades, and it always comes down to cost, and there is premium associated, no question about that in certain products. Premium for capital investment is absolutely a factor. However, what needs to the myth busting is when we start looking at life cycle cost, and when we start looking at long-term payback and long-term operational savings. And so what has been eye-opening for me anyway in taking my passive house certification is there's a whole level of looking at net value, present savings, looking at how we can start to quantify things and make decisions based on cost. So improving, adding 1 more inch of insulation, what that costs initially, but what that cost payback is over the long term, so that we can start as architects informing our clients and helping work through the tools with them to make more informed and better decisions for them. So yeah, it cut cost.
All right, we got another question. This is from Paul, who's with DuPont Performance Building Materials. He wants to know, do you feel Manitoba with the 2010 NBC and Saskatchewan both need to catch up to building and energy codes already in other provinces? She's nodding already.
Absolutely. It's actually, it's crazy. It's crazy that we are still, we're 2020 and we're still operating off of an ancient building code. But I really do have to say that I think we're headed in the right direction. And so part of the holdup in different jurisdictions has been taking a building code that's a national code and writing the Manitoba or the place specific, the regional amendments to it. And it's a process, as we can see, exemplified in this code cycle, that it takes too long, and we've skipped an entire cycle. And so moving toward step codes and performance-based targets, I think it gives a little bit more flexibilities to government, to provincial governments and jurisdictional governments, to be able to have a menu in front of them and say, this is the step that we are saying is our base, or these are the incentives that are associated with each of those steps. So yeah, I think it is improving, and I think I'm an eternal optimist as well. I think you have to be in this profession, so that could be part of it.
That's That's great. Thank you for that question, Paul, and thanks so much. Okay, I'm just gonna